So, welcome, Dr. Peele. 50 years ago, you wrote something that most of psychology wasn't ready to hear, that addiction isn't about the substance, it's about what's missing in a person's life. That the field spent decades arguing with you. The data kept proving you right. We started the Wired Ape because we believe the same thing from a different angle, that modern life stripped away the cultural technologies humans evolved to meet exactly the needs you've spent your career describing: meaning, connection, identity, transition, sport, community. You name the void. We're trying to understand what you use to fill it. That's why this conversation matters to us and why we think it matters right now. When the addiction crisis keeps deepening despite every institution effort to contain it. We honored you're here and we are genuinely curious where this goes. So my first question to you, sir, is Dr. Peel, in our first conversation, you said something that we haven't been able to stop thinking about. You said that WHO had to explain the concept of alcoholism to Greeks, that they had no framework for it, no word for it, no concept of losing control around alcohol. We've been sitting with that for weeks. So, what is Greece doing that America isn't doing?
Well, the World Health Organization did a study of cross-cultural applicability of concepts of alcoholism and addiction. And they did something that everybody would sort of think is logical, which actually disproves the whole fundamental assumption of their approach. They said there's something called psychological factors, and they will vary from culture to culture. But one of the leading researchers in this study is a man named Robin Room, who's been part of a whole movement that's moved the whole field in the wrong direction. Separately, there are physiological factors, and those can't possibly vary from culture to culture. And they found out that wasn't true. For example, when they went to Greece, they said, well, there are two characteristics that are basically physiological, and those are loss of control and withdrawal. And when they went to key informants, that was the nature of the study, and they asked them, they couldn't fathom, the interviewees couldn't fathom what they meant by loss of control and even withdrawal. When they tried to explain, well, when you stop drinking and you've been drinking for a long time, you undergo a physical upheaval. And they couldn't distinguish that, the expert interviewees, from what we would call a hangover. And they also couldn't understand the whole idea of loss of control, that because you drank, you would have to keep drinking.
Well, I think they should have understood it from the cultural context, but I think WHO maybe is more concerned with the universalization, more generic understanding.
They couldn't interpret it at all because they had no categories for interpreting it. Their pre-existing categories were, well, there's physical characteristics and there's psychological characteristics. And when that category, when that distinction was confounded, they just ignored it. And what it
Mm.
should have told them was that the most fundamental elements of addiction, and I've gone through that in my whole career of work. There's a book I wrote called The Meaning of Addiction, that distinguishing a supposedly psychological component to withdrawal is impossible, because the same people undergo withdrawal in some circumstances, but not in other circumstances. Like in a familiar, comfortable setting, they don't undergo withdrawal. And
Mm.
so this is a group of epidemiologists who tended to be socially oriented. When they found something that should have reoriented their thinking, they were incapable of doing it. They simply scuttled, I should say, their reaction. So what does that tell you about the so-called science of addiction? It tells you that it's prefabricated and put in place,
Mm.
and then people just use that structure, no matter how poorly it defines the phenomenon that we're examining and how incapable it leaves us with dealing with it.
Wonderful. So I think you're Jewish, right? You have a Jewish background.
I confess, yes, I come from a Jewish background, correct.
So just want to talk a little bit about the cross-cultural experience here in United States. For example, Italian Americans versus Jews in that example. For example, Italian Americans and Italians have different drinking patterns. Right? Italians drank more wine per capita, but has significantly lower rates of alcoholism as compared to Italian Americans. And historically, Jews have very less rates of alcoholism despite regular ritual use of alcohol in like Shabbat, Passover, and other ceremonies. I think is it because of social containment, meaning and timing attached to the consumption of these addictive substances? That creates a real difference?
You're not, I keep returning to the person of Robin Room. He started out as an alcohol. They didn't use the term epidemiology back when he began.
Mhm.
He did a series of studies called The American Drinking Man.
Mm.
And everything that he later asserted, they found strong cultural currents in drinking. They found that very few Jews and Italian Americans abstained, and very few of them had alcohol problems. The cultural
Yeah.
determinism was critical. Years later, he joined there was a cross-cultural study by of alcohol patterns in different cultures. He's one of the premier researchers. They discovered that there was a declining level of alcohol problems going north to south in Europe, from Northern Europe to Central Europe to Southern Europe. And ironically, believe it or not, there was a increasing level of drinking going from north to south. The Southern cultures drank the most. Italian, Greek, French, um, Jewish cultures in the Mediterranean, they drank the most and they had the fewest problems. So
Mm.
now, right away, they would rush in and you would imagine, well, okay, possibly that's due to social constraints. In fact, the greatest divergence in alcohol problems was found in alcohol-related mortality,
Mm.
cirrhosis and related conditions. There was 7 times the level in Northern Europe of death due to alcohol-related causes for Southern, and 3 times the level of alcohol-related deaths in Central Europe. So once
Mm.
again, they were left disarmed and incapable of interpreting their own results. Here's how they dealt with it. They said, what we'll do is we'll divide up the 3 areas of Europe to Northern, Central, and Southern, and we'll acknowledge that there's an inverse relationship in alcohol problems. Within those sectors, the more that you drink, the more problems you'll have of all sorts. So they rearranged the pattern, the cultural, the research synopsis and frame in order to fit the results into it. They did a further study. Because of the European Union, tariffs were removed on alcohol. And then Northern Europe is a heavily regulated alcohol market.
Mhm.
And so their prediction would be when they remove these tariffs, what would their prediction be? I'm
Mm.
asking you.
So can you please repeat it a little bit?
What would their prediction be? What would be the result of removing tariffs on alcohol in Northern Europe due to EU requirements?
Well, if they increase the tariffs, of course, the price of the alcohol will increase, and people will consume less. Maybe go to cheaper level of alcohol, which is worse for health.
Do you think they would? How would they predict alcohol problems would be affected by removing tariffs and cheapening alcohol buying coming from Southern Europe to Northern Europe? What would they predict?
They can think like, maybe if it's like too much available, the joy of like the social drinkingness of it just decreases, and you can just drink every day, something like that.
They would predict that alcohol problems would increase.
Mm.
And in fact, alcohol problems in Sweden decrease. Why would that occur?
Swedes maybe have more of a social containment in terms of drinking together, and it's like a more of a social event rather than just drinking and consuming alone. And maybe
Well,
society is like that.
they had that concept of drinking became transported, you would guess, to Sweden, where it was less natural than it was in Italy. And so, although more alcohol came to Sweden, more conceptions changed about drinking in Sweden, and drinking problems lessened. So, this is an Einsteinian breakthrough. It would
Mm.
allow you to see how fundamentally culture is impacting addiction and alcohol,
Hmm.
and they completely obfuscated that finding. They couldn't comprehend it, but they certainly didn't revise their conceptions, and they certainly didn't revise their policies.
Mm.
What policy would you deduce around alcohol based on that result? What would be a positive policy to come up with based on that result?
A positive policy, I can't tell.
You would market social drinking. You would make an effort socially
Hmm.
to market the concept of convivial, family-oriented drinking. But in fact, the reverse happened. Under the auspices of European WHO, they tried to reverse the social policies of Southern Europe.
Mm.
How would you reverse the policies of Southern Europe around alcohol to make them more like Northern Europe? What did they restrict in Southern Europe?
Well, I would market alcohol more as a festival thing, as a joyous thing, right? Even a thing
That's
that you
what they
consume in
should have
festival.
done. Northern
Yeah.
Europe aspired to and succeeded in raising the drinking age in Southern Europe. The standard drinking age in Southern Europe, do you know what the standard drinking age in Southern Europe was in Spain, Italy, Greece?
Yeah, I would
Guess.
say like 12 years. 12 years.
It's officially 16, but in a way, you're right.
Yeah.
There sort of is no drinking age, really, in Spain and Italy.
Yeah.
And when I went to Southern Europe with my daughter, when you went to lunch, they would bring a carafe of wine. They didn't ask everybody's age.
Mm.
And what concept are they trying to convey? What is a Southern European concept that's being conveyed that way?
I think they understand it as something that you do together, then you move on to do other things. It's not like an addictive thing that you keep drinking all day. That's not what alcohol is.
And it's a socially determined outcome.
Yeah.
A woman, a great researcher who came to be head of the Kettle Brewing Society because I think of my influence, she did a study comparing first drinking in Italy and first drinking in Finland. The point of the study was to see what their first drinking experience was like.
Mm.
But they encountered a problem with the Italian sample. Can you imagine what the Italian problem with the Italian sample was?
They just transitioned into it as a group. Like there was no
They
first thought
couldn't
of drinking.
conceive, they couldn't answer the question, when did you have
Yeah.
your first drink? That was a non-variable for them.
Yeah.
And so they have a whole different conception of alcohol. So
Mm.
how can we generalize this, would you say, to drugs then?
To drugs? Well, drugs consider addiction as a disease, as something that has to be firstly, diagnosed, then treated. But in the societies like the society we have talked about, it's not a disease. It's just something, it's like a ritual, right? You get together, you do something, then you
Are
move
there
on.
societies in which opioids and opiates are used in a ritualistic fashion?
Mm.
I'm asking you.
There are some societies that use opioids in ritualistic fashion. Yeah, again, there is a social container, right? They all get together. They
So
also
there
keep
are
an eye on each
some
other.
societies, opioids are not considered in Turkey and parts of Mesoasia.
Hmm.
Opioids were not considered a separate dangerous substance.
Mm.
And so internationally, the way that worked is they had to learn in Afghanistan that opioids were an illicit drug that you could make a ton of money from selling to the West. They had to be taught that concept because they had no special category for smoking opium.
Mm.
Opium wasn't like illegal or designated as a criminal problem.
Mm.
And so that created this amazing international problem where the West, in order to eliminate the growth and sale of opioids from Asia to the West, they had to explain to people, well, you can't do this. It's bad. It's addictive. And the most interesting thing to come along, when the Taliban came along, they bought into the eradicating opiate markets, and they came to be at war with their own natural tribal leaders who had no such concept. The same pattern occurred in South America with cocaine, where indigenous people they had to explain to them that cocaine was different
Yeah.
from other stuff and bad and had to be banned. And then then the Europeans had to eradicate the crops, which was like a genocide for the local population.
Mm,
So you see, we superimpose a legal mentality, but that legal mentality represents basic cultural conceptions, and it describes a way that we're incapable of recognizing
yeah.
the way the culture impacts scientific categories, especially in the field of addiction. Cultural conceptions fundamentally impact how people experience substances. And what that tells you is, in my work, The Meaning of Addiction, or I describe in my memoir, A Life on the Edge, how I differ in my approach to addiction, that the very categories that we use to conceive of addiction, people become addicted to an experience. That
Mm,
experience is infected. I mean, the drug affects that experience. Opioids have certain effects, but they're affected by individual differences. They're affected by situational differences, like the war in Vietnam, and they're
mm,
affected by cultural concepts. To fit the idea of being addicted to experience into a scientific framework requires us to have a whole different consciousness, not only
mm,
of addiction, but of science
mm,
and culturally, obviously. People can't escape their own cultures, and we can't do that. North
mm.
America can't reconceive opioids in that kind of a way, even though we had a major, not scientific experiment that proved that. Do you know what that experiment was?
No.
The Vietnam War. Opioids were widely used throughout Vietnam by American soldiers.
Mm,
And so they categorize soldiers as being addicted or not by going through a standard symptomatology. They asked them if they hadn't been able to receive opioids,
mm.
did they go through withdrawal? And if they did, then they were classified as opioid addicted. What happened when they returned to the US?
Well, they were addicted. Now they were alone, suffering from PT.
Exactly the wrong answer. Try again.
They were looking at replacements. The opiates they got there weren't available maybe in United States, and they started looking for other sources to,
Other sources of what?
other sources of like suppressing this desire to take, something addict like alcohol or, crack cocaine. Maybe it started at the same time.
Well, that's almost as wrong.
Hmm.
They cease to be addicted. 93% of them cease to be addicted. We're no longer addicted within 3 to 9 months.
Mm,
And that included the fact that 50% of them were able to obtain an opioid at home.
mm.
Even counting them, it still was only 14% became re-addicted. Why is that true? Why did they cease to be addicted even when exposed to the same drug?
Maybe there was no purpose to do it. Like they had to kill in Vietnam, right? You need to be in a different state. But
Well, I put purpose in a different fashion. When they got home, they had, I would think it was in a way more boredom in Asia. At home, they had a life. This is sort of my fundamental point. They had a family. They were able, for the most part, to get jobs. They were reintegrated into their community. And therefore, they had a whole different purposeful framework. And so, what should that tell us about how you tackle addiction?
to have some purpose in life, to do things with the community, to have some sort of
So the
ambition.
best way, if you would go to a now, the Vietnam soldiers, for the most part, came from mainstream America. They had a mainstream life to return to. There was a subgroup who were marginalized prior to coming to Vietnam, and they were more likely to become addicted returning. So the correct deduction would eliminate marginalization, get people integrated into life. What are some of the key components? Name 3 components that would be involved in getting people integrated into life. If you had to do that, if you could magically give somebody something, what would the 3 things be that you gave them?
Firstly, thing would be like they should have a social structure that they come into, like a family, If I
Yes,
there's
family
one thing.
would be one.
Source of income,
Work. They'd
work.
have to have some positive engagement. I mean,
Yeah.
and beyond work and family, we'll put community.
Yeah.
So, if we're getting into radical findings, everybody's aware of postpartum trauma based on war experiences. The actual research on that is very perplexing.
Mm,
A majority of the people didn't have post traumatic stress based on the amount of combat they had. It actually occurred in many cases in people who never entered combat. And what most determined post traumatic stress disorder was how well, finish my sentence, how well what?
how well they got back into a normalcy.
Exactly right. I think we're getting somewhere. How well they got reintegrated in society. And there are groups now, you know, just watching television that recognize that. There are groups
Mm,
that deal with return. The issue isn't, in terms of post traumatic stress, going back and reliving their trauma. The issue is what kind of a support life and integrative experience they have in America. More so perhaps than with addiction, I think veteran groups recognize that.
mm,
I mean, a veteran comes back, they don't psychoanalyze them or reconstruct the trauma of the battlefield. Many of them haven't been there. They work with them on becoming integrated into society, having work, hopefully, perhaps developing intimate relationships, being a part of a community. Would you say that's just total logical common sense?
mm,
It's not brain science. I mean, if somebody asked your mother or your grandmother, you know, how would you help somebody coming back from a war setting and they've been there 6 months or a year and a half or 2 years and they're extremely disassociative? What would you recommend? You would recommend these very things that we're talking about. The medical model and the
mm,
trauma model imposed on it by people like Gabor Mate says, oh, you've got to reconstruct the trauma they experienced, which is
mm,
exactly the wrong way around. And so it's another example of how the medical model misapplied both to addiction and to other things identified as emotional disorders are actually best conceived and dealt with in a societal community setting. Now, by the way, although as I often say, I should be receiving a Nobel Prize for this. The World Health Organization is split, it's bifurcated in two directions. The research on alcohol, where they can't, they keep thrusting their Northern European model on the world, is the epidemiological division. There's a
mm.
therapeutic division, which knows what I know.
Yeah.
The World Health Organization has for 20 years and more been pushing
Mm,
community responses to mental disorders over the disease model. Now, they're
mm,
not as confrontational as me. They don't go out and say these guys are screwing up the world. They say, well, look, here's some steps you should take. You should have a community response. You shouldn't take, for example, what are some what's an example of how you would approach something in a community way as opposed to a psychiatric or a medical way? What would be examples of extreme differences?
well, in community way, the festivals we talked about, right? So you just gather in a group, then you celebrate, I mean, different aspects of life, right? Which drinking is part of, right? I mean, I'm not denying that. But if you drink, like doctors say, right, in many podcasts we have seen, like even if you take one drink, that's going to destroy your brain, right?
Well, we're not talking about drinking now. We're
Yeah.
back to okay, we're back to community. What is community psychology or community therapy? It doesn't separate the individual off. A medical approach would say, oh, they're diagnosed with whatever,
Yeah.
PTSD or whatever addiction. We should diagnose and we should separate them off to be treated. The community response says, don't separate them, don't label them,
Yeah.
and don't separate them. So how does separating them? If we go back to your mother, I don't know your mother or your grandmother, but did your mother want you to play with other children? Did she emphasize that that would be good for you to go out and meet other kids and socialized?
Well, I grew up in a typical Indian household where playing sports was like considered very bad, like studying all the time was good. But when I grew up, she did promote more socialization.
But you came from an intensely supportive family background, I think. Is that true?
No,
No.
extremely academic.
Extremely Catholic?
Academic. Very studious.
Oh, extremely academic.
Academic, yeah.
Well, many of I'm 80 years old.
Hmm.
When I was growing up, a mother or a grandmother would say to somebody, "Go out and play with other children."
Yes.
Again, it's not brain science.
Nope, it's not.
That doesn't happen now. There's a best-selling author in America now. He's one of many. Do you think American children's mental health is doing well these days? Is it your impression?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
Everybody
not.
knows that.
Yeah, because
And he
individualistic society.
traces that to a combination of things, and I would use the word fear to underlie them. The fear of parents and the fear of children themselves. So the children parents are worried they're gonna go to the mall and take drugs and have sex or something like that. And in a way, what's the best way to avoid that? Well, crazily enough, you can reassure the parent by saying, "Well, maybe they should never leave their bedroom." And there's a technology that allows that now. Many, I'm not even going to call them children, they're now adolescents and young adults, interact completely through social media.
Yes.
So you've eliminated the danger of sex and you've eliminated the danger, possibly, of drugs, of street drugs. Unfortunately, we've been talking about what are the factors that enhance people's mental health, eliminating intimacy and actual social contact and social support. And when you add those things up, that leads to more anxiety and depression. And anxiety and depression are measurably
Yes.
increasing over the last 10 and 20 years, particularly with the youngest cohorts,
Yeah.
and specifically in keeping with the development of cell phones and social media. And so the bottom line is in America today, have never been more likely, we're at a peak in identifying in children at earlier and earlier ages psychiatric syndromes and giving them labels.
Mm.
Uh, the work on the social media maybe doesn't focus as much as I do on that part of the equation. What they focus on is um, the increase in anxiety and depression, and you might say bipolar syndrome and related obsessive compulsive, all of those syndromes is directly traceable to the lack of engagement, participation, community, and intimacy. Once again, going back to that was parents knew that. I mean, when I grew up in the 60s, well, people started to worry about drugs then. But a parent when I was growing up would be concerned if their child didn't go out and get involved with other kids at an appropriate time, go on dates, become a member of the community. That was their focus on lived experience for the child. Now, the entire focus is shifted to diagnosing a child with a disorder and
Mm.
treating the disorder. Our whole mindset, our whole cultural mindset is shifted. So I would just take this great work that's being done around social media and I would expand what the concept of it is. We're redefining what being human and how children are being brought up and how they are thought, how they come to think about themselves, their identities in a whole new way. In a strange medical sense, you feel, aren't we doing great? We're diagnosing more kids at earlier and earlier ages. Isn't
Yeah.
that wonderful? But in fact, we're cutting people off from the essential. My approach is called the Life Process Program, lifeprocessprogram.com. Um, So what I'm doing is really very simple. I'm taking an older model, a common sense model of how people are healthy and made healthy, and putting it into a therapeutic context.
Mm.
People come to the life process. We deal with marginalized groups and as a group, and we deal with individuals over the internet entirely, through video. And we deal with their addiction type problems. We're an addiction type
Mm,
program by saying, okay, let's hold off on diagnosing you as addicted. Let's explore your life
mm,
and tell me what's going on in your life. Are there any ways in which you're not feeling satisfied or purposeful or engaged in life? What are things that would make you feel more engaged in life? Are you religiously oriented? Are you intellectually oriented? Are you socially oriented? What would make you feel better integrated, be better integrated in your life if we enhance that capacity in your life? What would it take to do that? For example, maybe they need to improve their communication skills. Very pragmatic. So you see, it's a whole different model for dealing with the problem imposed into a therapeutic framework.
yeah. So I have a counter. Emil Durkheim, in his book The Elementary Forms of Religious Life in 1912, he described how ritual gatherings create a felt sense of social solidarity. He called it collective effervescence, right? But which is positive thing. We have talked about some examples. What about the pub culture in England, which actually increases addiction so much? Like, you keep on drinking all night and that becomes a habit, right?
So there's cultural things that encourage a lot of drinking, you said.
Yeah, like pop culture in England.
Kids are drinking less in the United States now and taking less drugs, but they're more fucked up.
Yep.
The issue isn't that kids have been drinking for quite a long while now.
Yeah.
Among the wars that are going on in America, that you can just see on watching television, the World Health Organization now emphasizes that you should never drink. World Health Organization has become a temperance, but there are a lot of people who drink, and ironically, drinking is a high-end activity. The more income and socially integrated you are, the more likely you are to drink. So, for example, NBC has um, a morning host, and he does a program um, where he interviews people. And just within a couple of weeks ago, he said, well, when we did this program, we decided to include dealing with prominent, successful people.
Yes.
The interviews are conducted in some very nice cafe, very high end alcohol consumption. And what they're talking about, of course, is the people's achievements and accomplishments. They're talking about what they started or how they became a movie producer or how they led some kind of social movement. I mean, still, there are people who appear on the show who are in recovery. Do you know what in recovery is in America?
No.
America is a recovery nation. People brag that they've discovered that they've been addicted and they are now in recovery, a term that grows out of AA, which what does that mean you have to do? I'm asking you.
When they're in recovery, it means they're not consuming that
You have to
substance.
abstain. That's the rules of
Yeah,
the game.
abstaining.
You're not allowed to cheat. And so they actually interview people. He doesn't say how he deals with people like that, but they show a lot of high end famous people drinking wine or sometimes cocktails or sometimes hard alcohol, but there are people that do it within a socially constrained situation. There are people who obviously know how to behave and control themselves. There are obviously people who know how to interact with other people, and there are people who know how to achieve goals in life. That's why they're on the show. It's not a
Yeah.
show that interviews recovering people, it's a show that interviews successful people. And they serve alcohol during the interviews because I don't know that they go this far in their thinking, but what they're thinking is, well, we want to show young people what it means to be successfully socially engaged, to pursue goals, to achieve things. I mean, they're not a therapeutic organization, they're interviewing famous people, but that actually is extremely therapeutic message.
So when you're part of a group, right, a social group, and you spend a lot of time with that, let's say you drink alcohol or consume other products, right, opiates or whatever. So there are two types of group. One group is very restraining, right? They let you drink maybe two drinks and they say, that's enough for today. How a person get out of a group which is like pro addiction, like okay, have one more, one more, one more, one more, that kind of you feel. Then what to do in that case?
Well, let's go back to the examples I'm talking about. If you're hanging around with a group of successful athletes or successful media people, as a rule of thumb, they're going to be functional and not
Yeah.
alcoholic because how much time can you spend intoxicated and be a world class runner or make movies? That all takes time
Yes.
and thinking and effort. When your focus, the group focus is on achievement and performance and professional standards, and people are valued not solely because they're successful, but they're appreciated because of their achievements. The purpose of the group isn't intoxication. Well, that's an anti-addictive group. If you're hanging around with a group whose sole entertainment or function or purpose is consumption of a substance, a bad indicator, a bad predictor. So if you had what would be the best thing that you would do? Let's go back to a child. Well, how would you approach your child? How would you encourage them?
I mean, I would actually tell my kids pros and cons of drinking. And, for, let's take an
We
example
wouldn't
of
talk about
drinking.
drinking at all. The Life Process program hardly focuses on alcohol consumption. What would you encourage your children? How would you encourage your children in order to avoid addiction down the road? I wrote a book called, with Zach Rhodes. Let me point to it right here. It's called Outgrowing Addiction. And I wrote a book called Addiction Proof Your Child by myself. How would you addiction out? How would you
Well, that's what I was saying. I will talk about the pros and cons and focus more on the cons and say,
We're
even if
not
you,
talking about drugs and alcohol. That's the wrong focus.
okay, I'll talk to the child
what would you want to encourage in the child?
to develop restraint, to control yourself, develop this willpower. Okay. Maybe.
Control, since you're thinking in negative terms,
Mhm.
what would be the best guarantee that your child wasn't likely to be addicted based on what we
To,
everything we've been saying?
yeah, to tell the child that I'm there. I'm a support system for the child. In case something goes wrong, child can always come and talk to
Well,
me.
that's you.
Yeah.
We're talking about the child. What should the child develop to be most successful in avoiding addiction?
Ambition, purpose in life.
That's the single best thing. And a lot goes along with purpose. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to have the skills to accomplish a purpose. If your child may have a variety of interests. Who knows? Athletes, athletics, academics,
Mm.
research, media. We're not in charge of what people become interested in, but we encourage them to be successful and achieve and to have a purpose in pursuing that. And then we help them to develop those skills. We may be able to assist them directly, or, we might want people who are better at that skill.
Yeah.
I mean, you may or may not be able to teach your child to play golf or to be a scientist or to write fiction. I mean, those are things you may or may not have some skills at on your own.
Hmm.
Your child just may have a different interest palette than you. And being a good parent is being supportive and encouraging
Yeah.
in pursuing a purpose, enhancing your purpose, building it, and developing the skills and options to exercise it. So the thing that
Mm.
would most reassure you about a child is if your child is very interested in something, almost anything, something constructive, something socially valuable, well, then you're going in the right direction and then you pursue it. Now, there's certain things not, only a few people become successful at. Being a basketball player, perhaps being a recording artist, a musician. Even in those cases where it's unlikely that they're going to become somebody, a famous basketball player or a famous musician. They're still developing the capacity to get positively engaged in something. And,
Yeah.
in life, they may have to turn that in a different direction. They're not going to be a rock star or a movie star, whatever, but they can develop a capacity to work constructively and to pursue goals the most important anti-addiction mechanism. It's not giving them warnings or
Hmm.
even, I agree with you. You don't want to make a fetish about alcohol or
Yeah.
drugs. You don't want that to be your everything's focused on that. You want them to be aware that people do these things in more or less destructive ways to make them aware of what a destructive involvement with a substance is. But that's not the fundamental task. The fundamental task is to allow and help a person to become.
So thanks for your time. And do you want to talk a little bit more about your life process program, how people register for it? Like, what is the group size? Do you conduct this group session or
Well,
one-on-one
let me
session?
talk about two things. I want to talk about my memoir
Yeah.
right here, Scientific Life on the Edge, A Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction. We've kind of been talking about a lot about that, haven't we? I think anybody watching this will come to realize,
Yeah.
he thinks about addiction and drugs and approaches it differently.
Yeah.
And it's not less scientifically, it's a refocusing on what the science is about. And the other thing is lifeprocessprogram.com is our website. And we have two thrusts there. It's an internet based coaching and sometimes self assistance program where I lay out the concepts that you and I have been discussing. And we provide exercises and ways of approaching these tasks. You can improve your communication skills. You can direct your goal setting. You can focus more on what positive values you have and what it'll take to proceed in them. For example, you value education, and we work on those building blocks of your life, and we avoid um, more than anything giving you any kind of a diseased identity. We
Yeah.
don't we never I mean, people contact us because they have some kind of issue, but we don't say, "Oh, you are a whatever, sex addict or a drug addict or an alcoholic or a food addict." We say, "Well, obviously you're encountering some problems.
Hmm.
Let's look at your overall life and how you can create a more fulfilling environment." And we also do a community-based approach with marginalized groups. There are whole segments of the population, as everybody knows, that are more likely to have negative outcomes with drugs and alcohol. Certain ethnic groups, homeless populations, prison engaged populations. And we engage with those groups rather, you can't put a whole native population into rehab. That's
Hmm.
stupid. What you can do is develop building blocks within that group and peer assistance and recognition in helping people to engage in society, which may be working against them. Maybe they may have various burdens that they have to overcome that they didn't come up with on their own. But still, the best way to deal with that is to develop an outlook that you can become a part of society and develop skills that you may or may not have in that direction to do that.
So is this program open to anyone from all over the world or in
The
United
Life
States? Oh.
Balance program, the internet individual program, is open to anybody in the world. It probably helps to speak English. Forgive us. The marginalized community program, we've dealt with groups. We're quite active in Canada.
Hmm.
There's been a Canada has shifted from being more harm reduction and community oriented lately to a more conservative disease approach. The same thing is true as America.
Hmm.
But we're a little easier to sell it. We have some clients in America, individual groups. The government is a harder sell in America from the way I think.
Yeah.
There's more opening in Canada, and we have some great connections. We work with something called the Ottawa Inner City Health.
Mm-hmm.
It's under the direction of a man named Rob Boyd. He operates out of Ottawa, and his mission is providing health care for largely marginalized homeless populations.
Hmm.
And we work with Rob Boyd and his amazing staff to market our whole approach to other groups and organizations who deal with challenged populations. Thanks for
Yeah.
giving me a chance to describe my life's work. I really appreciate you giving me that opportunity. I'm as I said, I'm 80 years old, so I'd like having the opportunity to describe my life's work and where I'm still pretty active. You don't think I'm senile yet, do you?
Yes, sir?
You don't think I'm senile yet, do you?
No, 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 you don't. I think
So
you're
I'm
pretty,
still
pretty
working. I still
yeah,
have a purpose, and it's
yeah.
helping me to avoid dementia. So, au revoir. Thanks for having me on.